1914. End of the old world. New technology, new tactics, new weapons, new pains. As the war began, there was an excited world. By the end of the war, everything would change. Millions of young people around the world who grew up listening to the war stories their grandfathers told. Young people who grew up hearing about the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, Sudan, the American Civil War. Millions of young people influenced by the stories of their ancestors. They were very excited. It was their turn. They would join the army, honor their countries, and write their own hero stories. But there was something they didn't know. Something they would learn bitterly. This war would be nothing like the stories told. Weapons, bullets, uniforms. Everything was changing. Millions who went to the front with their heads held high and with pride would return in a completely different state. If they could return at all. The war the whole world had been waiting for would begin on a hot summer day in 1914. On June 28th, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, visiting Sarajevo, was shot by Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip. The assassination caused a shock effect on the global agenda. The bullet hit not only Ferdinand but also peace, and it would ignite millions of bullets. Austria, following the incident, received a guarantee of support from Germany in case of war. Then it gave Serbia an ultimatum that was impossible to accept. On July 28th, before Serbia even responded to the ultimatum, Austria began bombing, igniting the fuse. Germany announced that it would consider a possible Russian mobilization as a cause for war. And Germany declared war on Russia on August 1st and on France on August 3rd. Germany, seeking a clean passage through Belgium to march on France, received a rejection, entered Belgian territory, and Britain considered this a declaration of war. Without exception, all states believed the war would end shortly, and that an absolute victory was not far. No one knew the effects of the monsters that had been created. So how did this new generation hell begin? The Germans would act according to the plan known as Schlieffen Plan in World War I. Named after former Chief of the General Staff Alfred von Schlieffen, who retired in 1906. The massive Russian army in the east would only be able to complete its mobilization in 6 weeks. During this 6-week period, German armies would appear to be responding with full force to France's attack on Alsace-Lorraine. But in reality, the majority of the army would encircle the French army attacking Alsace-Lorraine by passing through Belgium and the Netherlands, and would inflict a shameful defeat. France would fall in 40 days, and thus the real war, the Eastern Front, would begin. In the early days of the war, while the Germans defeated the Russians at Tannenberg, they also advanced toward French territory in the west. However, the plan built upon knocking France out would fall apart in early September. As the German armies advanced toward Paris, they made a major mistake near the Marne. The right flank units of the army were far ahead of the other units, and this situation was noticed by the retreating French. French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre launched a major attack on the German units left exposed near the Marne. There was no clear winner in the Battle of the Marne. While the Germans retreated to the Eisen Line, French and British forces cautiously followed them. The Germans would settle into positions along the Eisen Line and stop the retreat. But the real story would begin here. The famous Western Front was now beginning to take shape in broad outlines. With the collapse of Germany's quick victory plans, the war was turning into a trench war. But the combatants would come to understand in a very painful way that the war had reached a stalemate. In the struggle known in history as the First Battle of Ypres, tens of thousands of soldiers would fall victim to machine guns, massive artillery, and barbed wire. Every country had weapons of revolutionary importance. Perhaps the greatest of these revolutions was the machine gun. The Germans had the machine Gewehr 08. The Russians had the Pulemyo Maxima weapon. The French had the Hotchkiss, and the British had the Vickers and Lewis. Most of these terrifying tools were developed by following in the path of the first machine gun invented by American inventor Hiram Maxim in 1883, and they would leave a mark on the war. Especially in German war doctrines, the importance of the machine gun was great. German generals, who advocated the proliferation of machines instead of human elements, used large numbers of machine guns to pull back infantry armed with standard rifles into the rear ranks. This increased the production of machine guns. On the battlefield, a unit with a machine gun, if it could gain a good line of sight, could stop a 1,000-man unit. Realizing this, the German army began to build concrete machine gun positions. Thus, a few soldiers with machine guns could inflict bloodshed on a unit of hundreds. This situation slowed down the pace of the war significantly compared to before, especially while the effectiveness of machine guns was not yet fully understood. Thousands of soldiers would fall victim to this weapon. The fact that both sides had large numbers of machine guns would render the armies fixed in place. As machine guns shrank day by day, destroying them also became increasingly difficult. The Titan trench warfare had changed the whole game. In order to protect themselves from this fire, soldiers would have to wear dozens of kilograms of armor. But this was not possible either. Soldiers were helpless in the face of this monster. Moreover, machine guns were not the only problem of the war. Cannons, which had been an indispensable part of battlefields for hundreds of years, had now reached an incredible level. As a gift of the Industrial Revolution, cannons had grown to gigantic proportions. These cannons, if fired accurately enough, could take the lives of hundreds. Companies that were profiting greatly from the war were building larger cannons day by day. Governments were placing new orders, and the front was becoming bloodier by the day. But there was a problem with developing cannons. As they grew larger and more advanced, they also became heavier, making them impossible to transport and move. This rendered the cannons unqualified for effective and long-range operations. Artillery units advancing alongside infantry, as in ancient times, were now gone. For infantry unable to advance without artillery support, this meant a limitation in movement. As artillery grew stronger, neither those who possessed it could conduct operations, nor could those opposing it make a move. The defense of fortified positions was also increasing. Both sides were burying themselves in their trenches under the protection of artillery. Now, before launching an offensive, the artillery positions of the opposing side had started to become the first elements to be evaluated. Areas with fewer artillery positions were seen as weak points, and attacks were attempted from those spots. These battles would turn the battlefield into a place of immense brutality. The trench wars, as if all these horrific developments were not enough, would meet a new killer: poison gas. At the beginning of the war, the French and Germans had attempted gas unsuccessfully, and for various reasons, no results had been achieved. One of the Germans' first attempts was carried out near the Wolin region in Poland on the Eastern Front. They threw bombs containing poisonous gas at the Russian lines, but due to the cold weather, the gas froze and did not create the expected effect. As the rapid German advance came to a standstill and the conflict settled into the stalemate of trench warfare, Fritz Haber, later known as the pioneer of chemical warfare, revisited the idea of using poison gas to break the deadlock. Following an earlier unsuccessful attempt, he began working on a more effective deployment method. He turned to chlorine gas, a substance both lethal and fast-acting, which could be sourced in large quantities from paint manufacturing plants. The first large-scale use took place in April 1915 during the Second Battle of Ypres. With the wind in their favor, German forces released around 160 tons of chlorine gas from 6,000 pressurized canisters, directing it from their own lines toward French positions. The gas, carried by the wind, reached the enemy lines and caught 5,000 Allied soldiers completely off guard. The soldiers who saw the approaching cloud suffered horrific agony from the gas they inhaled before they could even understand what was happening. Colonel Henry Mordack, who witnessed those moments, described the soldiers. They were exhausted. Their coats were wide open. They were running like mad, screaming for water, coughing up blood. Some were even rolling on the ground, desperately struggling to breathe. The gases used would diversify and begin to show not only physical, but also psychological effects on soldiers. Poison gases would also claim the lives of tens of thousands in the trenches. As days followed days and months followed months, no solution could be found to trench warfare. Why couldn't the trenches be overcome? The trenches had a highly developed system. They didn't consist of a single line, but of three. The first line was the combat line. The second was the line where soldiers rested and were protected from artillery. The third was the line where the command staff, infirmary, kitchen, and other rear services were located. All of these trenches were protected with machine guns. Poisonous gases and large artillery pieces were not the only killers to appear in World War I. Another was barbed wire. Barbed wire became a complete nightmare once the Western Front turned into trench warfare. The unfortunate soldiers who received the order to attack from their commanders would perform a death run toward enemy trenches. If they didn't die from artillery shells, hand grenades, bullets coming from the trenches, or the hail of machine gun fire, they would reach the barbed wire, and to cross it, they had to move very slowly. If they managed to reach the wire by luck, they would be met with machine guns and mines placed between the wires. All of these developments were pushing the war into an ever-deepening stalemate. There was only one way to overcome barbed wire and machine guns: by destroying the position through hours or days of bombardment. But then, the enemy would be informed of the direction from which the assault would come. Protected trenches were being built specifically for machine guns as a precaution. In fact, the solution to the machine gun was armor, but equipping soldiers with armor of such size and weight was impossible. The armor had to be carried by something else, not the soldiers. The production of armored vehicles had begun in those days. However, the area between trenches, known as no man's land, was covered in giant craters caused by explosions. On such terrain, it would be a miracle for even a regular vehicle to advance 100 meters. Normal wheeled vehicles couldn't travel this land. Something else had to be found, something that could withstand the rain of bullets coming from the trenches. If a soldier were to reach the enemy trenches, he would need strong armor. But simply reaching the trenches wasn't enough. There had to be something capable of destroying both the trenches and the enemies within. All of these ideas were about to come together in a single mind, and more importantly, be implemented. Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Dunlop Swinton. He had served as an observer officer in the Boer War and the Russo-Japanese War. He had been able to closely observe changing battlefields and weapon technologies. In his diary, he would describe the state of the war. The first problem he encountered at the front was that both sides had heavy artillery to protect themselves and had time to strengthen their positions. Also, the fact that massive forces were compressed into a small region of France was another problem. On October 19, 1914, an idea came to Swinton's mind to solve the deadlock that had persisted for months. Inspired by the track tractor produced by American inventor Benjamin Holt, Swinton realized that a vehicle was needed, one that had powerful drive capabilities, armor that would not be affected by bullets, could destroy machine guns, cross rough terrain and trenches, overcome barbed wire, and be unaffected by piles of debris. Churchill was the first high-ranking military bureaucrat to recognize the potential of tanks and support them. In a letter he wrote to Prime Minister Herbert Asquith on January 5, 1915, he stated how modern warfare had reached a stalemate and that it was nearly impossible to effectively break through enemy defenses. Churchill proposed an experimental vehicle to the Prime Minister. He explained that track tractors carrying machine guns and covered with armor would not be affected by enemy machine guns, and would be able to easily tear through trenches and barbed wire. Design work continued with the Landships Committee and naval engineers. The first prototype appeared toward the end of 1915. Little Willie was the first fruit of the project. It was a rather small and agile vehicle. However, it was not yet suitable for use in war. The features desired by Swinton and the Army had not yet been achieved. A series of reinforcements and improvements were made on the Little Willie prototype. The newly created vehicle would be even better. The new prototype, called Big Willie, or Mother, would form the essence of the first real battle tank. Big Willie was built in a walled-off factory in Lincoln, England, by Chinese workers and technicians who were not allowed to see their families. 2 machine guns were mounted, positioned in reverse to face behind and to the sides of each cannon. A third was placed in the center of the driver's compartment, facing forward. The crew consisted of 1 officer and 9 personnel, 10 people in total. Its weight was exactly 22 tons. Its speed could reach up to 5.6 kilometers per hour. The 105 horsepower Daimler tractor engine allowed it to reach a maximum speed of 10 kilometers per hour on flat terrain. It had a 6-unit gearbox, 4 forward and 2 reverse gears. Big Willie was divided into 2 categories, male and female. These names were part of maintaining secrecy. The main weapon of the male Willie was the cannon. The females only carried machine guns. Swinton stated that he was inspired by nature in making this classification. According to him, the male Willie would have a sword and a design that protected the female. It would be the one to advance on the front lines during operations. By the end of 1915, all tests had been completed. The tanks could protect their crew, carry weapons, destroy machine guns, break through barbed wire, and cross enemy trenches. It had the capacity to carry 2 6-pounder guns and approximately 300 shells. It could be transported by rail and be ready to move at any moment. Everyone was very impressed and stunned by this performance. I'm attaching its photograph. Its appearance resembles a great antediluvian monster. It can easily cross swamps. The concealment of this newly developed vehicle was also one of the most important matters. If it were to be discovered through espionage, the enemy could act quickly and steal the design. A coded name had to be found, and thus the famous name Tank was born. Most of the workers involved in its construction believed they were manufacturing water-carrying vehicles for the armies fighting in Egypt and Mesopotamia. The British were working intensely to maintain secrecy. This is precisely why tanks carrying cannons were called male, and those carrying machine guns were called female. The Germans, engaged in espionage, had no idea what to make of phrases like, "Today, 12 males will arrive for you. 6 females will follow shortly." To give the impression that the tanks were snow-clearing vehicles during delivery, the phrase "Attention to Petrograd" was written in Cyrillic on them. This, too, was to disrupt potential espionage activities. At the beginning of 1916, the British accelerated the production of their new toys. To address problems related to tanks, a tank supply committee was formed. Lieutenant Colonel Albert Stern was placed in charge of the department. Eustace de Eyncourt, the architect of many ships belonging to the Royal Navy, was also on the committee. Swinton was appointed as the commander of the tank units in March. Initially, the organization consisted of 15 companies. Each company had 2 sections of 6 tanks each, and a full company consisted of 15 officers and 106 soldiers. Training began secretly and without tanks at the training camp in Beasley, located 25 kilometers southwest of London. The first units were selected from the Navy's artillery school and the machine gun corps. Tank engines were ordered from America. At the first stage, the Army ordered 150 males and 100 females. The tanks produced were tested with German machine guns. The tank committee wanted the tanks to be painted cream, but this would prove to be a futile request because once the tanks entered the trenches, into no man's land, they would handle their own camouflage with mud and earth. Despite many issues encountered on the production line, Britain was doing its utmost to get these new monsters to the army fighting on the front lines. From the Marne onward, the Western Front kept getting worse day by day. Since 1915, the trenches had expanded significantly, and the commanders who still believed that the war could be won through offensive action had not yet understood the realities of this new kind of war. This war, by its very nature, favored the defending side. Command staffs that refused to face this reality for a long time wanted to win through final offensives, but every clash resulted in tens of thousands of casualties. The Western Front was never satisfied with blood. 1916 would be the year of the apocalypse. After the Battle of the Marne forced the war into a deadlock, Helmuth von Moltke was removed from the position of Chief of General Staff. He was replaced by Erich von Falkenhayn, a figure who would also be important in Turkish history. Falkenhayn was increasingly realizing that the possibility of victory was fading. As long as he fought three major armies at once, things would continue to worsen. He wanted to eliminate the French by launching a battle of attrition that would force them out of the war. He chose another historically significant location for the assault, the city of Verdun. Verdun had historical importance for the French. Therefore, the French army would have to defend it at all costs. The goal was not to capture Verdun, but to inflict on France such irreparable casualties that they would be unable to recover. Falkenhayn, in his own words, wanted to bleed the French dry. But the result did not go as he expected. The longest battle of the World War was fought at Verdun. From February to December 1916, for 10 full months, both sides together created another hell. During the battle, approximately 40 million artillery shells would be fired. The total death toll on both sides would reach 300,000, with 750,000 total casualties. In the battle to take just one hill called Dead Man's Hill, the French would lose 89,000 men and the Germans 82,000. Once again, there would be no winner in this war of steel and bone. While the horrors of Verdun continued, the French wanted their British allies to launch an assault to relieve German pressure. The two countries, which had been planning a joint offensive since late 1915, had suspended the plan due to Germany's Verdun attack. An assault that would begin south of Verdun would force the Germans to divide their forces. French calls for this effort would be answered in the summer of 1916. The British planned an offensive of a scale never before seen in their history. The assault, planned by Douglas Haig, would be executed by the Fourth Army under General Rawlinson's command. But the Somme did not begin as the British had expected. In a week-long preparatory bombardment that began on June 24th, the British rained 1.5 million shells on German trenches. Believing that nothing could have survived the hellfire they unleashed, the British left their trenches with confidence. They formed ranks and calmly walked through no man's land for a while. But the Germans, who had been on alert due to the week-long bombardment, once again set up their machine guns against the approaching British. By the end of the first day of the Somme, 19,000 British soldiers were dead and 57,000 had been wounded. Like the other battles, the Somme was becoming a grave for thousands of soldiers day by day. Losing the moral upper hand, the British advanced the timeline of the project they had been working on in extraordinary secrecy for months. As it would be the first of its kind, they were also very curious about how it would turn out. Preparations were not yet fully completed, tactical plans and training were not yet finished, but General Haig could no longer wait. Autumn rains were coming. It would also be a morale booster for the demoralized units. So, what was coming? Male, female, Willie, mother. Whatever it was called, History would record it under one name: tank. On September 15th, 1916, it was finally on stage to make its debut. Just after 7 a.m., British artillery fire rained down across the entire front. I jumped to my feet, grabbed my flare gun, and ran upstairs. Shortly after, I saw the wave of fire coming toward us. The trenches were covered in smoke and fire. The sentries ahead rapidly retreated, and the trenches were occupied. The sentry standing next to me suddenly started shouting, "Commander, something four-cornered is coming." I immediately looked in that direction and realized it was a tank. The piece perched on its roof indeed gave it a square appearance. We thought we could handle 1 or 2 tanks. We had no idea there were so many of them. We opened fire immediately. But unfortunately, we could not make the slightest impact on this monster. The British drew lessons from the disaster they had suffered on the first day of the Somme. Infantry tactics had been seen as unimportant during the initial assault. This had led to tens of thousands of casualties. 2 weeks after the catastrophe of July 1st, intensive preparations were made for the assault that would take place on July 14th. Every step the infantry would take was planned. Determined not to relive the first day's disaster, the British would capture the positions previously marked in no man's land and launch their assault. In the week prior to the Somme, hundreds of thousands of shells had been fired at German trenches, yet the desired effect had not been achieved. On July 14th, the German trenches would be pounded again, this time with 5 times as many shells. The British were determined to play the game differently this time. In previous attacks, trenches had been bombarded for hours or even days, and only after some time had passed would the assault begin. This time things would be different. Everything started as the British had hoped. German trenches were being pounded with deafening intensity. The Germans had no opportunity to even raise their heads. But the real surprise was yet to come. Almost like a precursor to what would later become the hallmark of German warfare, the Blitzkrieg tactic, the British launched an assault with terrifying intensity immediately after the bombardment. The Germans, who hadn't even had a chance to breathe after the hell created by the artillery, were stunned when confronted by the British attack. In the first minutes of the battle, the British were quickly taking the German forward trenches. Having also captured the support lines, the British were very hopeful about this assault. However, once it came to the main trenches, the fundamental rules of the game came into play once again. This war was always more merciful to the defenders. The labyrinth-like trenches stretching for dozens of kilometers began to slow the infantry assault. As had happened many times before, the assault turned into a horrific war of attrition. Still, despite the losses, July 14th was an assault that gave the British courage. General Haig began planning another offensive. But reinforcements and new plans had to be completed first. That's why they would wait until September. The 2-month interim period will go down in history as another horrific phase called the Forgotten Battles. During this period, the British launched exactly 90 small assaults on German trenches, while the Germans responded with 75 counterattacks. The darkest period of the Somme was the Forgotten Battles. For a mere 5 square kilometers of land, the British would suffer 80,000 casualties. During this difficult waiting period, a massive deployment was being carried out to the front under extreme secrecy. This shipment carried a major surprise, both for the British soldiers in the trenches and for the German troops across from them. No first child has ever been greeted with as much excitement as mother, and no mother has ever loved playing with her child as much as we loved playing with it. Training with it is like playing with a giant toy. We drive around crushing trees. We imagine entering Berlin with it and have fun. This is how Basil Henri Quays, commander of one of the first tanks ever built, described his introduction to the tank. It was a monumental event for everyone. There was no equivalent, no precedent. Everyone was encountering it for the first time. But being inside these new toys was a terrifying experience for the soldiers. Our tank goes 8 kilometers per hour. We're a bit faster than the infantry walking beside us. At maximum speed, the smell, the heat, and worst of all, the noise, each one is unbearably horrific. The time had come to test these toys. The tanks, which had been worked on for months and built from scratch, were now taking the stage for the very first time. 49 Mark I tanks were stationed with great secrecy behind the lines near the Somme trenches. It was decided that the tanks would move in small groups of 3. Each crew member was given a leather helmet, a pair of goggles, a gas mask, and a pistol. The already cramped interior of the tank was filled to the brim with barrels of motor oil and 30,000 rounds of ammunition for machine guns. The conditions inside the tank were horrific. The expectations for these first tanks sent to the front were clear: reach the enemy trenches, cross the barbed wire, silence the machine guns, and rain hell on those in the trenches. If hell is as bad as what I saw at Courcelette, I wouldn't want even my worst enemy to go there. On the night of September 14th to 15th, the tanks moved to their starting points. The tank assault would begin near Delville Wood. What would happen here would lead soldiers to call the forest Devil's Wood. Each tank was given a route to follow and the exact time it would leave its starting point. About half an hour before sunrise, at around 6:10, the engines that would usher in a new era were started. According to the plan, the tanks would reach the first enemy trenches a few minutes before the infantry and wait for them there. With heavy bombardment beginning from the British trenches, the infantry and the tanks in front of them began to move. Both the soldiers inside the tanks and the infantry around them were very excited. Would this new invention actually work? The real question was, how would the German soldiers react upon seeing these monsters? The British secrecy efforts had paid off. Not a single German knew what was coming. The Germans observing from the trenches first began to hear a sound in the distance. One of my soldiers stared for a long time, as if he had lost the strength in his limbs. He seemed frozen. The great monsters were slowly but steadily advancing toward us. Another soldier shouted, "The devil is coming." Many of them lost control from fear. The Germans were horrified by what they saw. Most of the soldiers had never even seen an ordinary car in their lives. The first thing they encountered was these terrifying giants. As they approached the trenches, some soldiers, trying to shake off the initial shock, set up their machine guns and began to fire at the tanks. But the key to the war, the machine gun, had finally met its match. It could hardly do any damage to the tanks. The tanks, advancing slowly but confidently, were now very close to the trenches. Against the approaching monsters, the German soldiers were helpless. Some tried to resist, some screamed, and a large number began fleeing toward the rear trenches. Encountering tanks was a terrifying experience. For the tanks that had reached the trenches, it was now time to use the advantage of their design. The very purpose of the machine guns placed on both sides was this: to rain death upon the trenches. Near the village of Flers, one of the tanks reached the trenches, effectively cleared them out for a while, then continued on and swung behind German lines. In fact, in one trench extension, it took the Germans by surprise and captured 300 terrified German soldiers. The new toy had had a terrifying effect on the enemy. Across the front, thousands of German soldiers panicked and fled upon first contact with the tank. September 15th was the tank's first performance, but it was still far from opening the door to victory. Although it had a significant impact on the Germans, both the assault and the tanks were a major fiasco. Of the 49 tanks brought in for the assault, only 9 managed to achieve their objective. 17 of the 49 tanks broke down before even reaching the front line. 9 suffered mechanical failure during the operation. 5 got stuck in the muddy terrain of no man's land and its surroundings. 9 tanks were heavily damaged and stopped, effectively being used like artillery batteries or machine gun nests. Only 9 tanks reached the points planned before the operation, significantly reducing infantry casualties, crossing barbed wire and machine guns, and breaking up the trenches. The new invention was new to everyone. The generals and commanders had virtually no more tank training than the soldiers in the trenches. Therefore, it was used very poorly. The tanks had been distributed among the infantry units. A plan had been adopted for them to operate independently from one another. This prevented them from creating a serious impact. In addition, the terrain was poorly chosen and poorly studied. Communications were a disaster. Because of the tank noise, let alone communicating with the outside, soldiers couldn't even hear their own voices. Some tanks, acting without knowledge of one another, lost their way. Carrier pigeons were used to communicate with headquarters. One tank even had to return because it had forgotten pigeon feed. The tank commander's field of vision was also extremely narrow. Being inside a tank was like a mental war. One tank commander even said that he got so frustrated with his tank that he fired his pistol at the engine to make it go faster. 2 tank commanders would later admit to having a panic attack during the assault. The first operation involving tanks at the Somme, the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, in general terms, also a fiasco. The objective of the assault was to break through the German line via the Somme and open a major breach. But shortly after the failed September assault, the autumn rains arrived and the trenches overflowed with water. Advancing became increasingly difficult, and the Germans were regaining their footing. Like many earlier operations at the Somme, this one would also end in failure, with an incredible number of casualties. Although not as large in scale as the Somme, the battles of Thiepval and Beaumont-Hamel were also significant in terms of experience. Both were points where the Germans had held out with firm resistance and could not be overcome by infantry assaults alone. At Thiepval, for the first time, an attack was launched using only tanks and infantry without artillery or other supporting weapons. The enemy trenches were crossed so quickly that the Germans could not even get their machine guns out of their bunkers to respond. Though the number of tanks used in the engagement was small, they were important for the psychological effect they would demonstrate later on. The soldiers who participated in the battles shared a common view. They said that German soldiers who were in a position to win the battle surrendered collectively under psychological pressure when faced with tanks. Yet in history's first tank-involved battle, the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, the 9 tanks that achieved success were critically important. Their success showed that the tank was a workable idea. They had significantly reduced casualties and effectively saved the lives of hundreds of tanks being manufactured in factories. The tanks had not produced the desired overall effect, but General Haig bore a significant share of the blame for this. Because of his impatience, the tanks had been deployed to the field prematurely. His constant fear that the great secret would be exposed only heightened his impatience. The discussions about how tanks should be used were not yet over. Even the engineers hadn't finished their work. The tank crews, selected from the Navy and machine gun units, didn't even know what they were working on for a long time due to the extreme secrecy. Their training had been purely theoretical, without access to any actual tanks. Additionally, Haig had rushed into the assault to beat the autumn rains. All these factors contributed significantly to the failure. One of the most important names in the birth of the tank, Winston Churchill, harshly criticized Douglas Haig. He would say that by prematurely revealing their invention, all elements of surprise and the entire plan had been ruined. The premature use of a handful of tanks exposed the jealously guarded secret of this newly discovered key to the French deadlock and sacrificed the right to a decisive strategic surprise for the sake of a local success. Nevertheless, many began to believe that this invention could become much more effective in the future. Douglas Haig, in particular, was deeply impressed by how helpless it left the enemy, the support it gave to infantry, and the significant reduction in casualties. Indeed, just 4 days after the September 15th attack, the debut of the tank, he placed an order for another 1,000 tanks, clearly showing his admiration. Another concern for the British was the tanks lost at the Somme. Some of these tanks fell into German hands. They were handed over to German engineers for examination, and Germany would rapidly join the tank race. Although tanks could not unlock victory in 1916, the improvements made day by day would eventually change the course of the war. At the same time as the British, the French were preparing a surprise of their own. In France, the driving force behind the tank was Jean-Baptiste Estienne. General Estienne had shown his vision early in the war, before tanks had even been invented, with a remarkable statement. "Gentlemen, victory in this war will go to the side that is first to mount a 75mm gun on a vehicle capable of crossing all kinds of terrain." The first concrete tank concepts in France came from the artillery officer Estienne. As was often the case in the First World War, Estienne was both an officer and an inventor. Even before the war, he was designing infantry support equipment and spending a great deal of time in military factories. He closely followed the Russo-Japanese War and the Balkan War, closely observing the new generation warfare that unfolded there. Estienne's innovative ideas were not accepted in the early stages of the war. The French military already had armored vehicles in its inventory. Due to their failures in trench combat, the French were skeptical of Estienne's proposals. When he initially failed to gain the support he sought from the army, Estienne reached out to Schneider, a military-industrial firm researching tank concepts. Schneider was more receptive to Estienne's innovative thinking. Thus, Estienne began collaborating with engineer Auguste Eugène Brillier to develop a prototype. The first goal set for the tank was to be a vehicle capable of crossing barbed wire. However, as Estienne wanted to fully armor the vehicle and equip it with various weapons, the design kept evolving day by day. The prototype work that began in December 1915 was completed in March 1916. The first fruit of this intense labor would be the Schneider CA-1. The CA-1 came from the French term char d'assaut, assault tank. By late 1915, it was clear that the war had reached a deadlock. The French army, suffering from horrific casualty numbers, had begun searching for solutions. It was during this time that Officer Estienne, who clearly saw the war's deadlock, managed to persuade General Pétain, and the French army placed an order for 400 tanks. However, the Schneider CA-1, like almost every country's first wartime tank, would turn out to be largely a failure. Its appearance was very odd. The chassis was taken directly from Holt tractors without any modifications. The British had adapted the same chassis to suit the Mark I, but since the French used it as is, the result looked strange. The tracks were quite short in relation to the tank. Additionally, its overall size was much smaller than the Mark I. Production continued with the belief that this smaller size would make the tank harder to hit. However, the tank's design was a complete fiasco. Especially the gun at the front was a serious design flaw. The gun barrel was very short. Its firing angle and range were extremely poor due to faulty design. The short tracks also caused major problems in trench warfare. Because of its physical structure, the Schneider would frequently get stuck in no man's land, bomb craters and German trenches, becoming a nightmare for its crew. The tracks struggled to support the oversized upper body. In rain, mud and soft terrain, that is, under even mildly problematic ground conditions, the unevenly distributed weight caused it to get bogged down. One of the most famous generals of Second World War, George Patton, had volunteered with the French army during World War I. Patton would describe the Schneider CA-1 as the worst tank of the First World War. The tank caused so many problems that the planned improved models were shelved and remained only on paper. The French tank efforts had shifted from providing relief to frontline soldiers to becoming more of a financial competition. While Schneider was working on tank production, another major company also began manufacturing tanks. Named after the town where it was produced, Saint-Chamond would become the second tank adopted by the French army. However, this tank would be an even greater fiasco than the Schneider CA-1. The use of the Holt tractor chassis and short tracks made the tank's movement significantly flawed. Instead of the short-barreled 75mm gun used on the Schneider, it was equipped with a full-size field gun of the same caliber. The field gun size created a large protrusion at the front of the tank. The vehicle might have performed well on flat terrain, but on the Western Front, flat ground was almost non-existent. The 2-meter protrusion caused by the field gun created problems in every trench and dip. The Germans found a simple solution to counter these tanks. Attacking tanks could drive over German trenches and keep going. But if the trenches were widened, the tanks would have to drop into them and then climb out. In this way, Saint-Chamond, with its nose extending 2 meters forward, would get stuck while descending into trenches. Since the tank was produced simultaneously with the CA-1, it shared many of the same issues. As seen, France's second tank attempt would also end in disaster. However, toward the end of the war, a model to be produced by Louis Renault through Estienne's efforts might change the very fate of tanks. Estienne had been in contact with the British since early 1916. He had witnessed the birth of tanks firsthand. He believed that tanks, as allies, should be used jointly in operations. While the British rapidly completed the development of the Mark I, Estienne tried to convince them to wait for the French tank, but he failed. Schneider, the firm that manufactured many of the French army's artillery pieces, tried to keep pace with the British, but it was unsuccessful. In fact, the British rushed to produce and deploy their tanks, which caused Estienne's plans for coordinated tank usage to fall apart. The year 1916 became a showcase year for tanks. It was now almost certain that tanks would take center stage in 1917. Tanks would be used more professionally, with better coordination with aircraft. Instead of small, paired deployments, mass tank assaults would become the hallmark of 1917. Moreover, British tanks would no longer be alone on the battlefield. France had also begun deploying its tanks and expanded tank usage on the Western Front. It wasn't just the attackers who evolved, the defenders would too. For the first time, the Germans used armor-piercing bullets, laying the foundation for anti-tank tactics. They also began placing multiple rows of trenches one after the other to make it harder for tanks to break through. Furthermore, instead of positioning their artillery in fixed locations, they began distributing them between trenches for use against tanks. Although Somme and Verdun didn't deliver a conclusive result to either side, their consequences would influence the course of the war. Germany was fighting alone against three great powers. On the Western Front, the British and French. On the Eastern Front, the Russians. All were putting immense pressure on the Germans. Verdun, which had been initiated by Falkenhayn and had turned into a nightmare for the Germans, had given birth to the Somme. The Germans, who sought to bleed the French at Verdun, would also be struck from the east. In early June, Russia, seeking to aid its allies, knock Austria-Hungary out of the war, and corner Germany, would launch the Brusilov offensive, named after General Alexei Brusilov. The Germans attacking the French at Verdun would now find themselves squeezed by the British at the Somme and the Russians in the east. The year 1917 would become a year of more offensives, more casualties, more trenches, more horror. You have no idea what the words "only artillery activity in Flanders today," printed in a simple and light-hearted way in the newspapers, actually mean for us. For the past 3 hours, a corporal has been lying next to me, moaning, with one arm and both legs torn off by a shell. All day long, artillery fire has been raining down on us. Rather than constantly wondering whether the next shell will cripple or tear us apart, it's much better to launch the boldest attack at any cost. In 1917, the world was now fully at war. The number of fronts and belligerent states had significantly increased. However, these increases favored the Entente powers. The Central Powers, led by Germany, were inching closer to inevitable defeat. Having attacked the French at Verdun, the Germans received their response from the British at the Somme. While both battles were still ongoing, the Brusilov offensive coming from the east strained the Germans, both in terms of supplies and manpower. The German armies, spread over a vast front, were no longer capable of defending such an extended line. The possibility of the front breaking was dangerously high. The Germans were in no condition to endure another battle of the Somme. The army was exhausted to counter the Russian successes in the east. Troops also had to be redirected there. Paul von Hindenburg, who replaced Falkenhayn as chief of the general staff, recognized the situation. In early September, a meeting was held with Erich von Ludendorff and other commanders. Hindenburg asked Western Front commanders for suggestions on a new and shorter defensive line to be built in France. He would tell them that no reserves remained for operations, apart from those planned for Romania. General Jörg Fuchs proposed building a defensive line from Arras to west of Laon. This would shorten the front by 40 kilometers and free up about 10 divisions for an offensive in Alsace-Lorraine. During the same period, the French and British armies were planning a major offensive. At the end of 1916, Joseph Joffre was removed from command of the French armies and replaced by Robert Nivelle. Nivelle was a confident and eloquent commander. In 1917, he presented a new operational plan promising a decisive victory. The plan required the British to carry out a diversionary attack near Arras to distract the Germans from the French offensive. Nivelle would employ the same tactics he had used successfully at Verdun to crush the Germans within 48 hours. The plan echoed the promises made since the beginning of the war. The Germans would supposedly be routed within 2 days and retreat toward Berlin. Both Douglas Haig and Philippe Pétain were skeptical of Nivelle's plan. However, Nivelle's powers of persuasion were as effective as his command. He first convinced French politicians. To the soldiers, he said victory is near. There would be no more Verduns, and thousands of lives would not be sacrificed for minor gains. Don't worry, Nivelle promised. If my plan fails within 48 hours, I will halt the offensive. Everyone wanted to believe these familiar sweet words one more time. The French put their trust in Nivelle with the last drops of confidence they had. As the French prepared for a massive offensive, the Germans were preparing a move that would largely disrupt Nivelle's plans. Around this time, Nivelle made a critical mistake. He began promoting the offensive to politicians and journalists. The Germans noticed this publicity and realized the French were preparing for an attack. German reconnaissance planes flew continuously over the Western Front throughout the winter of 1916 to 1917 to find signs of Anglo-French offensive preparations. During one trench raid, the Germans also captured plans related to the French attack. A major crisis loomed for the French. For the construction of the new defensive line, 12,000 Germans, 3,000 Belgian workers, and 50,000 prisoners of war, mostly Russians, labored. While the new line was being built, the Germans planned massive destruction in the areas they vacated. Everything of value in the French countryside was destroyed. Roads were damaged, wells poisoned, houses booby-trapped, and the local population evacuated. Only barren land was left behind. With Hindenburg's approval, the retreat to the infamous Hindenburg Line, prepared over 5 months, took place in February-March 1917. The area where Nivelle planned to launch his offensive was precisely where the Germans had pulled back after inflicting horrific devastation. The Nivelle offensive, named after its planner and jointly carried out by the French and British, began on April 9, 1917, with the British diversionary attack, the Battle of Arras. The British successfully deployed soldiers and tanks to the front with great secrecy and launched a surprise assault using effective artillery. Under General Edmund Allenby, the British Third Army and the Canadian Corps attacked along a 23-kilometre front following a preparatory bombardment by 2,800 artillery pieces. After a week of fighting at Arras, on April 16th, the French offensive began under General Nivelle's command. Known to history as the Nivelle Offensive, this operation would bring disastrous results for both sides and mark the tank's first appearance in 1917. British tanks appeared at Arras, while French tanks made their debut at Chemin des Dames. The French Schneider CA tank was unveiled here for the first time. But the Germans had already encountered tanks at the Somme. As a countermeasure, they had dug wider trenches along the Hindenburg Line. They also used armor-piercing bullets and aircraft against tanks. The French were inexperienced with tanks, and infantry-tank coordination was lacking. As a result, defeat for the tanks was inevitable. Most tanks broke down before reaching their targets. Those that did were hit by aircraft and artillery or abandoned by their crews. The British had also not learned enough from the Somme. Tanks were still scattered among infantry units. Moreover, spring weather conditions were harsh, snow from winter remained, and heavy rains persisted. Artillery support failed due to poor weather. Many tanks lost their way, broke down, and suffered heavy losses. Like the offensive itself, the tank assault achieved no significant results beyond minor gains. Robert Nivelle continued the offensive he had promised, would drive the Germans back to Germany within 48 hours for a full 23 days. The British suffered 150,000 casualties, the Germans 130,000, and the French nearly 200,000. The soldiers at the front had had enough. They were about to revolt against their commanders in an almost unprecedented manner. Poilus, who had been fighting for 3 years, were utterly exhausted. In every senseless and pointless assault, thousands were cut down by machine guns, wire, artillery, gas, and more. On May 3rd, the 21st Division, which had endured the harsh conditions of Verdun, did not respond to their commander's order to attack. French officers were shocked. The real shock came when other units along the same line followed suit. About 30,000 soldiers from over 50 divisions were now saying enough was enough. They were abandoning the front and rushing to see their families, whom they hadn't seen in years. Those who didn't desert mostly remained in the trenches but still refused to follow orders. It was believed that the disobedience that had begun in Russia at the time influenced the French army. However, these events stemmed more from the soldiers' dire conditions than from politics. The Poilus, who received the lowest pay and endured the worst rations among Allied armies, hadn't had leave in years. After the disaster of the Nivelle offensive, despair settled over the French soldiers. They could no longer go on under such conditions. Having failed to deliver on any of his promises, Nivelle was dismissed. General Pétain, his replacement, would improve the conditions for his troops and meet many of their demands. He told the soldiers exactly what they most wanted to hear. From now on, their lives would not be wasted in futile attacks. Aware of the army's fragile state, Pétain allowed only limited offensives. In his words, the Allies would wait for tanks and America's entry into the war before attempting such madness again. 1917 was a year of significant developments for tanks. Drawing on their experience, the British began to improve their designs. As a continuation of the Mark series, the Mark II and Mark III tanks were introduced. However, while these models featured only minor improvements, they played no major role in combat. The real change came with the Mark IV. It was essentially a sum of the modifications and corrections made to the first three models. As one of the most produced and widely used tanks of the First World War, its success spoke for itself. The Mark IV's superiority lay in the correction of earlier design flaws. One of the major issues with earlier models was their weak armor. Previously, only the front of the tank was protected by a strong plate. This plating was now applied to all sides except the rear. The Lewis machine gun, one of the most effective weapons of the war and well liked by soldiers, was now installed on tanks as well. The transition to a softer edged and taller vehicle not only prevented technical problems with the tracks, but also enabled the tank to climb out of deep craters more easily. The engine also posed serious problems. While tanks often had a shock effect, the noise and exhaust smoke made them easily detectable even at night. For this reason, the Mark IV was fitted with an exhaust pipe equipped with a long silencer. Horsepower was also increased to improve speed. The British would go on to identify the Mark IV as the ideal tank. There was another critical development regarding tanks for the first time. Tanks were deployed outside the Western Front and trenches. They were sent to a very familiar place, Palestine Front. The Turks would encounter tanks for the first time during the battles of Gaza in Palestine. Although these tanks, deployed against the Ottoman Empire, showed some effectiveness, the Ottomans managed to stop 8 Mark I tanks during the Second Battle of Gaza. However, in the Third Battle of Gaza, the British Army, reinforced with 5 tanks, attacked the Ottomans from an unexpected direction, defeated them, and opened the way for the fall of Palestine. Alongside improvements to the Mark series, the British also began developing lighter tanks. Just 5 days after the Mark I was unveiled at the Somme, General Haig tasked William Triton with producing a light tank. The main feature desired in this tank was speed. While the Mark performed well in trenches and defensive lines, Haig wanted a faster vehicle to gain an advantage in pursuing the enemy. Among soldiers, this vehicle came to be known as the Chaser. In operations, it was often used alongside cavalry rather than infantry. These medium-class tanks, influenced by the design of Little Willie, were called Whippets. The Whippet had 2 powerful engines. If one engine was hit or failed, the other could keep the vehicle moving. Like cars, the engines were mounted in the front. Thanks to its small size and lightweight, it was twice as fast as the Mark tanks. However, it was not as successful at crossing trenches. Its effective maneuverability allowed it to operate in villages, towns, narrow and rough terrain, and wooded areas. What made the Whippet truly significant was the inspiration it provided to the French. General Estienne, the driving force behind French tank efforts, was greatly impressed by this small hound. The first 2 French tanks had been nightmares, and a new solution was desperately needed. France no longer wanted to produce the CA1 and the Saint-Chamond, both of which placed a heavy burden on its industry. Aware of this, Estienne began working on a cheap and easily produced tank inspired by British medium tanks. There were doubts about the effectiveness of such a small and light tank, but the general trusted his idea. He believed a light, highly mobile tank could be easily transported to desired locations and would offer major advantages. Taking a major gamble, Estienne ordered hundreds of tanks during the design phase. But this gamble would become one of the most successful in the war. Louis Renault and engineer Rudolf Ernst Metzmeier would go on to produce a tank that would be considered the ancestor of modern tanks. Its features would serve as a model for many successful tanks produced in the future. They dared to do something that had previously been considered, but never implemented. The tank would have a rotating turret capable of 360-degree movement. As in the Mark series, tanks would be classified as male or female. Female tanks would be equipped with Hotchkiss machine guns, while male versions would mount a 37mm cannon. While the tank's small size and speed were advantages, it suffered from a weight imbalance that leaned forward. To address this, modifications were made to the track assembly. Instead of using two equally sized axles as in standard Holt tracks, the front axle was enlarged. A tail extension was added to the rear to improve balance, resulting in a small but stable vehicle. Tanks that had entered the battlefield in late 1916 underwent massive development in 1917 and were now beginning to influence the outcome of the war. In the summer of 1917, the British were nearing the peak of their tank production capacity. Tanks were no longer a secret, and tank units were now referred to as the Tank Corps. Mark IV tanks had entered service and received training for mass assaults. When the French Nivelle offensive ended in disaster, the British, hoping to relieve pressure on their allies, began preparing a major offensive. Additionally, the Germans had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and were tightening the noose around the island nation of Britain. General Haig believed that a successful offensive could help capture key Belgian ports. If successful, the German submarine campaign and supply routes would be dealt a heavy blow. But before launching the offensive, the lines needed to be secured. To the right of the salient in the north was Messens Ridge, held by the Germans. This 46-meter-high ridge dominated the area and had to be captured. The British had a unique surprise in store for the Germans. Underground mining techniques, developed to solve the stalemate of trench warfare, had been in use for some time. Miners and engineers had dug tunnels and planted explosives beneath enemy trenches in earlier battles, causing major disruption. Both sides had become proficient in this type of warfare, but what was prepared at here would surpass all previous efforts. There was as much activity below the ground as above it. As the fronts widened and trenches stretched on, the conflict gradually extended into the earth itself. From 1916 onward, both sides began constructing vast underground tunnel systems. However, the Germans made a big mistake in this region. Prince Ruprecht's Army Group Chief of Staff, Hermann Joseph Kuhl, held a meeting with commanders of the 4th Army to review the area's defense. The consensus was that no exceptional measures were needed, the lines had been updated, and the artillery was expected to perform effectively. Even the German tunnels were considered strong enough to endure a possible attack. Reports seemed to confirm this confidence. But something very unexpected lay ahead. A day before the planned offensive, on June 7th, 2nd Army Commander Charles Harrington addressed his men with a memorable line. "Gentlemen, I don't know if we will write history tomorrow, but we will certainly change geography." His words were not without reason. British engineers had placed a massive amount of explosive material, 450 tons, under the hill. Before sunrise, British artillery opened fire, only to fall silent moments before the sun appeared. On both sides, soldiers waited, Germans ready in their lines, the British anticipating the command to move. A quiet 20-minute pause followed. The battlefield grew so still that birdsong carried through the air. Everyone was bracing for what would come next. Then suddenly, In less than half a minute, a chain of powerful underground detonations reshaped the landscape, carving out 19 vast craters. Within seconds, thousands of German troops were caught in the blasts. The coordinated detonation had a profound effect on morale, stunning and overwhelming those who witnessed it. Some accounts describe soldiers losing their sense of direction entirely. The sound was said to be the loudest man-made noise of its time, reportedly reaching as far as London, some 200 kilometers away, and even Dublin. In Lille, France, it was compared to an earthquake. This was the deadliest single-moment loss of life in history. Messines would go down in history for both the massive mining operation and the first battlefield appearance of the new British Mark IV tank. Anticipating a tank assault, the Germans had mined terrain where tanks were likely to advance and used poison gas to hinder night movement. Nevertheless, the mass tank assault, combined with artillery clearing the mines, succeeded. Tanks once again exerted psychological dominance and helped capture numerous prisoners. For the first time, aircraft operated alongside tanks, in addition to artillery and infantry. German armor-piercing rounds failed this time because the thin armor of earlier models had been replaced. In the week-long Battle of Messines, tanks and supporting forces achieved notable success. General Haig was now ready to launch his main offensive to seize the Belgian coast. He selected General Hubert Goff's Fifth Army as the main force, but this was a mistake. Unfamiliar with the terrain around Flanders, Goff favored a deep breakthrough. Though Haig warned him not to repeat General Nivelle's errors, Goff ignored the advice. The Germans, expecting a British assault at Ypres, had reinforced their already strong defences. Worst of all was the terrain. The Ypres region, close to the sea, was fertile farmland with many irrigation ditches, canals, and dikes. The Germans, holding 5 defensive trench lines, deliberately destroyed local infrastructure, creating swamps and thick mud in front of their lines. The terrain, already torn by shelling, was disastrous for tanks. In what would be known as the Third Battle of Ypres, 216 Mark IV tanks were deployed, but Passchendaele would prove a nightmare for everyone. Infantry and artillery struggled to function. Night maneuvers were chaotic. Mud. It was everywhere, where we rested, where we ate, where we marched, a heavy, endless stretch of wet earth. Some fell into it and never came back up, others grew weaker and faded within it. Footing was uncertain. Men slipped into pools where water and soil had mixed. Signs of hardship were scattered all around. A glove here, a torn boot there moving forward felt like walking through a bad dream. When morning finally came, it brought no relief. Just more craters and thick, clinging mud. Rifles stood upright in the ground, quietly marking the places where others had once stood. Most tanks became stuck in the mud. For the first time, tanks also came under aerial attack. The 100-day nightmare of Passchendaele ended with 300,000 casualties on both sides. The Third Battle of Ypres was essentially the Somme of 1917. During this time, JFC Fuller, one of the most vocal supporters of tank warfare, had planned a surprise raid on the Cambrai region, considered the most tank-friendly area of the Hindenburg Line. Cambrai and its surroundings had not been heavily bombarded and weren't plagued by the mud of Passchendaele. Fuller presented his plan to British Third Army Commander Julian Byng, who approved it. But it was initially rejected by General Haig due to the ongoing Passchendaele disaster. After witnessing the nightmare of Ypres unfold for a third time, Haig finally gave the green light for a morale-boosting success. As 1917 came to a close, the Western Front would witness one of the largest and most effective tank offensives of the war at Cambrai. But the biggest surprise came from another nation: Germany. The Germans had finally begun developing their own tank. a monstrous hybrid of the Mark, Schneider and St. Chamond designs. Soon, tanks would face tanks. Until now, tanks had been designed to support infantry. From now on, infantry would exist to support the tanks. As the war entered its final year, all nations were now aware of tanks. Many had even begun producing their own. Britain stood as the most seasoned nation in this endeavour. Since the Somme, the British had deployed tanks on the battlefield, learning with each engagement how they ought to be used. Until late 1917, tanks were seen largely as an auxiliary tool, machines meant to help infantry cross barbed wire and silence machine guns. However small successes were achieved, they were far from delivering the decisive victory commanders longed for. The vision of tank theorists J.F.C. Fuller and Ernest Swinton as a single striking force had not yet been fully applied. In their view, tanks had to be deployed collectively, advancing in coordination with air, infantry and artillery elements to achieve near-perfect synergy. By late 1917, Fuller's concept was finally embraced. The chosen battlefield was Cambrai, a site of both strategic and geographic importance. However, this was not the primary target itself. Between the St. Quentin Canal and the Northern Canal stretched two parallel waterways, roughly 8 kilometers in length. Seizing this line was the first priority, securing the flanks of the operation. The ultimate aim was to break open a serious breach in the Hindenburg Line. If that could be achieved, the region would be enveloped from the flanks and the Hindenburg Line itself would be ruptured. Cambrai AI, a section of the Hindenburg Line not yet devastated, offered ideal ground for a large-scale tank offensive. 3 commanders came together to plan the operation. General Hugh Ells, head of Britain's Tank Corps, and Lieutenant Colonel J.F.C. Fuller prepared a plan convincing enough to win over General Julian Byng. Tanks, infantry, and aircraft would strike simultaneously. If executed according to plan, such a massive assault would be unstoppable. Above all, secrecy was paramount. General Byng secretly gathered hundreds of tanks and 8 infantry divisions, concentrating them along a small section of the front. History was about to witness the first great mass tank attack at Cambrai. The 20th of November 1917. At around 6 in the morning, the city of Cambrai awoke to a thunderous roar. With all their weight and clamour, dozens of Mark IV tanks revved their engines and rumbled forward toward the German trenches. Unlike in earlier operations, the ground was much more favourable. For perhaps the first time, tanks advanced across clear, solid terrain. At the outset, British plans worked with extraordinary precision. The sudden assault shocked the German army. Overhead, British aircraft supported the attack, putting the Germans under even greater strain. Yet the fog that benefited the tanks proved a handicap for the pilots, who could scarcely see their targets, indeed, even one another. Despite this, the impact of the tanks on the German positions was staggering. Tank Commander Captain Brown later recalled the opening hours. The German outposts, dazed by the sudden rain of shells, were quickly overrun. Along the whole line, tanks crouched low, then reared up, clawing their way forward toward the shattered town. But as so often before, the advance slowed as the hours passed. The British, who had driven deep through gaps hundreds of meters wide in the German lines, began to tire. Once the initial shock wore off, German forces recovered with the arrival of reinforcements. The decisive factor was the flood of troops transferred from the Eastern Front, closed by revolution in Russia. Yet these reinforcements encountered something entirely new, machines they had never seen or heard of. For many, This first confrontation with the four-cornered monsters sent them fleeing from the trenches, retreating just as had happened so many times before. Still, the British assault was losing momentum. Around Havrincourt and Graincourt, the combination of infantry and armour achieved success. But elsewhere, chaos disrupted the carefully laid plan. Some commanders, fearing the heavy fire directed at the armoured vehicles, deliberately pulled their men away, shattering the intended coordination. Even so, by the end of the first day, the British had made an advance far greater than in most other battles of the Great War. Where gains were usually measured in mere yards, the armies at Cambrai had pushed forward 6 kilometres in a single day. Yet their achievement came at terrible cost. By nightfall, 179 tanks had been destroyed or disabled, abandoned on the battlefield. The tank corps had suffered grievous losses, but the British appeared to have secured their first day objectives. From the second day onward, however, everything changed. The cooperation between tanks and infantry grew steadily worse. Tanks pressing forward without infantry became easy prey for German troops. But the most dreadful challenge awaiting the British would not come from German infantry. On the third day of the battle, through the clouds over Cambrai appeared a figure destined to become a legend of the First World War, Manfred von Richthofen. Perhaps he was the last person the British wished to see over Cambrai. For by this point, the Red Baron had already brought down nearly 60 Allied aircraft. By the time of his death in April 1918, the tally would surpass 80. At Cambrai alone, he would shoot down 2 British planes in just a few days. After roughly 10 days of British attacks, another nightmare awaited them: the German counter-offensive. From the second day of the battle, the steady arrival of reinforcements had made the German army ready to strike back. At 6 in the morning on the 30th of November, for the first time in 2 years, German troops went on the offensive. The unprepared British were caught completely off guard. Launching attacks across the whole front, the Germans recaptured one position after another. After 3 days of ferocious counterattacks, General Haig realized that he had no choice but to withdraw. With heavy losses, the British abandoned their objective at Cambrai. For the 3rd year in a row, they had failed to break through German defenses. Yet Cambrai left its mark on both sides. For the British, the battle convinced many commanders that these machines were indeed game changers. More importantly, the almost perfectly coordinated advance of the first day created a powerful propaganda effect. That initial success was so celebrated that church bells were rung across Britain. Tanks, hailed as marvels of modern technology, were paraded through the streets at home. Souvenirs and products were created to capitalize on their fame. The message to the public was clear: if we are to do more, support your army. Britain expanded its tank program and refined its tactics and strategies further in 1918. But it was the Germans who drew the most important lessons from Cambrai. Until then, their high command had regarded these monsters with skepticism. Now they understood just how effective they could be. A few weeks earlier, General Ludendorff, a classic product of the Prussian school, had declared, "The best weapon against tanks is coolness, discipline, and courage." But after Cambrai, he admitted, "No one can deny that tanks have achieved some successes. It is certain they will become an effective weapon. I believe their production must begin at once." Germany's own tank program would accelerate. The first German steps toward tank development had been taken in November 1916, 2 months after the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, where they had first encountered British tanks. The Supreme Army Command assigned the 7th Transportation Department of the Prussian War Ministry to design a combat vehicle for battlefield use. The committee overseeing the tank program was headed by Joseph Vollmer, a prominent engineer of the time. Yet Vollmer himself could not quite understand why the task had not been given to the great industrial firms. The reason was simple. Companies like Krupp, Benz, Daimler, or Maybach believed the tank race had already been lost. They did not wish to risk their business standing by engaging directly in such a state project. By then, other nations had already built tanks and were even refining their models. Germany, however, faced a greater challenge: raw materials. For most of the war, the country had been under a naval blockade imposed by the Entente powers. German war doctrine prioritized aircraft and submarines, not tanks. Shortages of essential materials were severe. Even Germany's powerful industry was struggling to stay afloat under such conditions. Design work began in late 1916, but unlike in other countries, the Germans did not treat it as a centralized state project. There was still no real infrastructure for producing this new type of weapon, and the shortages in German industry forced production to be spread across several different firms. This lack of coordination caused delays. Some companies even had to order parts through occupied Belgium due to the blockade. In one sense, however, the Germans were luckier than the Entente powers. They already had models to study. The British Mark series, the French Saint-Chamond, and the Schneider CA1 served as ready-made examples. They drew particular inspiration from captured Mark tanks and from the Saint-Chamond, whose blueprints they had acquired. As with earlier tanks, the Germans adopted the male-female distinction. Male A7V carried a single 57mm Maxim Nordenfeldt gun and 6 machine guns. The female versions were armed solely with 8 machine gun. Yet the A7V introduced several innovations that set it apart from its predecessors. One of the most important was the suspension system. With suspension, the A7V moved more smoothly than its rivals, providing greater comfort for the crew and thus more accurate fire. Another feature absent from Allied tanks was the commander's cupola, which allowed officers to observe the battlefield and direct the tank more effectively. The A7V was also designed with protection against gas attacks. In case of a gas assault, its hatches and doors could be sealed completely to prevent leakage. The sides were protected by 20mm of steel, the front by 30mm, and the roof by 10mm. Unlike other designs, its armor extended down over the tracks, reducing their vulnerability. However, the steel used was not hardened, leaving the A7V vulnerable to anything stronger than machine gun fire. In terms of crew, the A7V was more like a moving fortress than a tank. Depending on the operational plan, it carried between 17 and 25 men, virtually a small squad inside a steel shell. With so many extra features, one might expect it to be slower than its rivals. In fact, it was not. The tank was powered by 2 4-cylinder engines, jointly developed by Mercedes and Daimler, producing around 100 horsepower each. On flat ground, the A7V was not only faster than other heavy tanks, but could even outrun the Renault FT-17, the nimble ant of the battlefield. On paper, the design looked formidable. In practice, even building the prototype was painful. Engineer Joseph Vollmer was forced to scour scrapyards for parts. Such was the shortage of raw materials. At last, in May 1917, the first prototype was presented to the German army and passed all tests with flying colors. But Vollmer's triumph was followed by disappointment. Instead of hundreds of tanks, the army ordered only 20, and even that order was placed with reluctance. German industry simply could not risk committing more resources under wartime conditions. In fact, it was barely capable of producing even those 20, because different factories handled different components. No two A7Vs were entirely alike. Only if it proved itself in combat would orders be increased to 100. By the end of the year, the first A7Vs rolled out of the factory. Yet they would not be Germany's only tanks. The British had lost large numbers of armoured vehicles in battle, and these tanks weren't just Mark tanks either. Whippets, along with French Saint-Chamonds and Renault FT-17s, also fell into German hands. These captured machines, dubbed Beutpanzer, were repaired, repainted in German colours, and put into service. By 1918, British steel bore the Iron Cross. The decisive moment of the war was drawing near. German Chief of the General Staff Paul von Hindenburg and his deputy Erich Ludendorff had come to realise that the outcome of the conflict would be determined by a race against time. But over Europe loomed the shadow of a far greater danger for the Central Powers. A single telegram had been enough to draw America into the war. Yet, in the face of Europe's vast armies, the United States was still far from being a real threat to the Central Powers. Despite its powerful economy, America's military was weak, only 128,000 men, poorly trained and ill-prepared. Even these soldiers required intensive drilling before they could be thrown into battle on the Western Front. When Woodrow Wilson's chosen commander of the American Expeditionary Force, John Blackjack Pershing, toured the trenches in France, he concluded that the United States would need a force of 3 million men. The government was stunned. For the first time since 1914, Germany held numerical superiority on the Western Front. But the Americans were on their way. In November 1917, Ludendorff gathered his staff to discuss the situation. His aim was to knock Britain out of the war. The French army, already shaken by mutinies, was still fragile. If Britain were eliminated, France would surely collapse as well, leaving no war for America to intervene in, no trenches in which its soldiers could be deployed. The operation would go down in history as the Kaiserschlacht, or Spring Offensive. Ludendorff chose to strike near the Somme, the site of the hellish battles of 1916, at the scene where British and French forces met. Here lay the weakest point of the Allied line. 3 great German armies, some 78 divisions, would launch a colossal assault. Germany had steadily refined its infantry tactics as the war dragged on. General Oskar von Hutier had systematized new methods that came to be known as the Hutier tactics. Instead of mass infantry waves, troops advanced in small, fast-moving groups, leaping from position to position. Their goal was to find weak points in the defense and penetrate rapidly into the depths beyond. It was, in effect, the ancestor of the famous German Blitzkrieg yet to come. Ludendorff's Operation Michael began at 5 in the morning on the 21st of March 1918. The British were overwhelmed by a storm of fire, unable even to raise their heads from the trenches. Against the incredible speed of the German advance, the British army was stunned into paralysis. By evening, German forces had advanced almost 11 kilometers. One of Ludendorff's key objectives was the critical transport hub of Amiens. Yet after several days of shock, the British under General Julian Byng rallied and resisted. Still, after 2 weeks of fighting, the Germans had advanced some 65 kilometers, a remarkable achievement under the conditions of the First World War. Day by day, the Germans drew closer to Amiens, but they faced increasingly stiff resistance. Reinforced British units gradually slowed the assault. The Germans were now just 20 kilometers from the city. The two sides clashed ferociously at Villers-Bretonneux, the last stronghold before Amiens. For the British, losing Villers-Bretonneux would mean the loss of the railway junctions upon which Amiens depended. The city would be defended at any cost. Villers-Bretonneux would not be remembered for hand-to-hand infantry combat, but for something far more extraordinary. For the first time in history, tanks from opposing armies faced each other in battle, the world's first tank versus tank engagement. The Germans had managed to field their limited number of A-7Vs in time for the Spring Offensive. But there were too few for any massed armoured attack. Instead, they were employed in small-scale missions, supporting infantry and clearing trenches. At Villers-Bretonneux, this was once again the case. Yet, unexpectedly, 3 A-7Vs advanced too far and suddenly found themselves confronted by 3 British Mark IVs. 3 against 3. The first tank battle in history unfolded before the crew's eyes. The British Mark IVs, under the command of Lieutenant Frank Mitchell, faced off against the German A-7Vs, commanded by Lieutenant Wilhelm Blitz. For all involved, it was an entirely new experience. Mitchell's section included 2 female Mark IVs armed only with machine guns, and 1 male armed with a cannon. This left the British at disadvantage. Mitchell's male Mark IVs fired first, but its opening rounds glanced off the armour of an A-7Vs. Before the gunner could reload for a third shot, German machine gun fire forced the crew to take cover inside their tank. Blitz's lead A-7Vs returned fire, but failed to score a hit on Mitchell's vehicle. As the males slowed to aim more carefully, the 2 female Mark IVs were struck by the A-7Vs and forced to retreat, leaving Mitchell to fight alone. At last, Mitchell's Mark IV found its mark. A shell slammed into Blitz's A-7Vs, transforming its interior into chaos. Wounded and dead lay among the crew, while Mitchell's gunner fired again, and then a third time, until smoke and flames filled the German tank. The survivors panicked and abandoned the machine. Seeing their commander's A-7Vs ablaze, the other German tanks withdrew. The first tank battle in history ended as a victory for Frank Mitchell. The fate of the A-7Vs in the area was little better. Blitz's stricken machine, A-7Vs, was blown up by the Germans themselves to prevent its capture. A-7V Mephisto became stuck in a shell crater and abandoned, while A-7V Elfriede toppled over on rough ground and was likewise left behind. Even Villers-Bretonneux itself, captured by the Germans at such cost, was retaken by the Allies within days. After the failure of Operation Michael, Ludendorff launched 2 further coordinated offensives. One struck near the Chemin des Dames Ridge, intended to pin down the French army. Then, once more, the Germans would turn against the British in Flanders. On the 27th of May, 41 German divisions stormed the weak French positions on the ridge. Caught completely by surprise, the Allies collapsed. General Duchesne, like Britain's General Gough before him, failed to organise a proper defence. On the first day, the Germans captured the heights, advanced 21 kilometres, and tore open a gap nearly 40 kilometres wide in the French lines. This great success persuaded Ludendorff to abandon his planned attack in Flanders and instead push toward Paris. Over the next 3 days, German forces made tremendous gains. For the first time since 1914, they reached the Marne River. Now Ludendorff's army stood only 88 kilometres from the French capital. But this would prove to be the high watermark of the German offensives. On the 15th of July, the Germans launched their final great assault of the war, the Second Battle of the Marne. 52 German divisions went forward under the cover of a massive artillery barrage. But the Allies had learned their lessons. This last offensive played directly into the hands of Ferdinand Foch. On the 18th of July, Allied forces, spearheaded by fresh American troops and supported by 350 tanks, struck the German flanks. On the first day, they advanced 8 kilometres, threatening to encircle the German spearhead. Recognizing the danger, Ludendorff ordered a retreat. By the 4th of August, the Marne salient had vanished, along with Germany's final hopes of victory. Logistical problems, Allied reinforcements, and stiffening defences brought the Germans to their final limit at the Marne. The spring offensive, launched by Germany to decide the war, had achieved some successes but failed to reach its objectives. Ludendorff, unable to secure the decisive breakthrough, began to see the end of the road. But by then it was too late. For Germany, the game was over. American forces under John Pershing had begun landing in Europe. The great gamble undertaken by Germany was now clearly lost. Compared to the beginning of 1918, when Germany briefly held numerical superiority on the Western Front, the situation had turned disastrous. The Germans had suffered around 700,000 casualties. Replacing these losses was becoming nearly impossible, while the Allies grew stronger with each passing day. From America alone, 500,000 fresh soldiers had already reinforced the Allied lines, and more were on the way. Worse still for Germany, the men being lost were the most skilled and irreplaceable, the trained Sturmtruppen. Their absence could not be made good. The Second Battle of the Marne was not merely another defeat for Germany, it was the beginning of the end. Foch's counter-offensive would become the 100 Days Offensive, the final push that ended the war. Across 4 major operations, the German armies clashed with the British and French on multiple fronts, wearing themselves out. By mid-1918, Allied tank production had reached its peak. In every battle, German forces were struck harder and harder. At the Battle of Soissons, for example, the French deployed nearly 500 tanks, 100 Saint-Chamans, 123 Schneider CA-1S, and 255 Renault FT-17s. The Germans could oppose them with just 5 tanks. The imbalance was glaring. The Germans, having already failed in the Materielschlacht, now paid the price by losing the Kaiserschlacht as well. The Second Battle of the Marne was not only a lost battle, it was the beginning of the end. The counter-offensive, led by Foch, and the Allied armies entered history as the 100 Days Offensive that brought the First World War to a close. Reinforced by American troops, the British and French launched massive assaults beginning with the Battle of Amiens in early August. Amiens would also stand out as a special battle for tanks. Supply tanks for logistics, transport tanks for carrying infantry, and support tanks all took part. In total, more than 500 tanks were deployed. The British had also fielded the improved Mark V. Coordinated strikes by tanks, cavalry, infantry, and aircraft turned Amiens into a catastrophe for the German army. Thousands were killed or taken prisoner. Erich Ludendorff would later describe the opening day of Amiens in grim words: August 8th was the blackest day in the history of the German army. Everything I had feared and warned of so often came to pass in a single place, in a single day. Reporting the battle to Kaiser Wilhelm, Ludendorff received a reply that summed up the situation: "We have reached the limits of our capacity. The war must be ended." The new Allied offensives, striking at exhausted Germany, had a crucial difference from the early years of the war. No longer did they concentrate on one point in hopes of a great breakthrough. Instead, corps from Belgium, France, Canada, Australia, Britain, and other Allied nations attacked across the German lines like swarms of stinging flies, keeping the pressure constant while avoiding catastrophic losses. They could see Germany's energy draining away, and they were simply waiting for the door to finally break. The days when a kilometre of ground required weeks of fighting were over. Germany's problems were not confined to the battlefield. The population, demoralised and exhausted, now demanded peace. Many statesmen, including Hindenburg and Ludendorff, feared that if the war did not end soon and reforms were not enacted, the people might rise in revolution just as they had in Russia. After all, when US President Woodrow Wilson had brought America into the war, he had spoken of a relatively mild peace. How bad could the terms really be? Ludendorff, in naive optimism, even believed that Alsace-Lorraine might somehow be retained. On the 3rd of October 1918, both Germany and Austria-Hungary sent a peace note to Wilson. But British Prime Minister David Lloyd George and French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau had no intention of agreeing to a soft peace. Moreover, Wilson hinted that an armistice would require Germany to abandon the monarchy altogether. In practice, the conditions being discussed amounted to unconditional surrender, something Germany could not accept. Yet Germany had no options left. Around the same time, at the Battle of St. Quentin, the Hindenburg Line was pierced in several places. Dozens of kilometers of breaches had opened, and the war was about to reach the German homeland itself. Chaos reigned across the country. Though unwilling to accept unconditional surrender, The German army was forced into retreat throughout October as its great defensive system collapsed. Then came the worst-case scenario. In the Navy, sailors mutinied, refusing to obey orders in their desire to end the slaughter. At the same time, the atmosphere of revolution hung heavy over German cities. Workers struck, crowds filled the streets, and the winds of socialism threatened to bring about a German version of the Russian Revolution. In a desperate attempt to calm the situation and prevent outright revolution, Chancellor Max von Baden announced on the 9th of November 1918 that Kaiser Wilhelm had abdicated. Germany now stood at the brink of both revolution and armistice. In just a few days, the unthinkable had happened. The nation faced the threat of invasion. Its army mutinied. Its people rose in revolt. A socialist revolution loomed. The Kaiser was forced from his throne, and the once mighty German Empire was swept aside in a sudden regime change, giving way to the Weimar Republic. In this atmosphere, in the forest of Compiègne near the French town of Ruthons, the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918, bringing humanity's first great catastrophe to an end. On the 11th of November 1918, people all over the world celebrated, dancing in the streets, drinking champagne, and hailing the armistice that meant the end of the war. But at the front, there were no celebrations. Many soldiers believed the armistice was only a temporary measure, that the war would soon begin again. When night fell, an otherworldly silence gnawed at their spirits. For the first time, men sat around log fires on the front line. They tried to reassure themselves that no enemy batteries watched them from the next ridge, that no German bombers would come to destroy them. They spoke in low voices. They were uneasy. The long-awaited peace brought anything but calm. Like the soldiers, the peoples of Europe were restless and angry. Whether victors or vanquished, many nations were shaken by uprisings. People, crushed under terrible conditions, could no longer be suppressed, and in city after city the flames of revolt flared. The war had ended, but the mission of the tanks had not. The very machines that had stumbled through their apprenticeship on the battlefield now turned their guns upon the crowds. The war to end war, or the war to end all wars, phrases often used to describe the First World War, proved to be tragically optimistic. The aftermath of the conflict became the seabed of dozens of new wars. The victors demanded that the defeated pay the price. The suffering and destruction had to be accounted for, and the burden placed upon the losers. The harsh conditions imposed would reshape the world in unforeseen ways. Some nations resisted these terms directly. Others nursed their thirst for vengeance, and in doing so, prepared to drag the world into a new inferno. The First World War laid the foundations for many innovations, most of them to humanity's detriment. Tanks were one of these, but they would not remain a novelty. They would continue to evolve year after year. The story of the tank was only just beginning.